Welcome and thanks for watching this special USA Today Network in Florida interview with U.S. Senator Marco Rubio. In case you've heard, he's running for re-election. I'm Matt Reed, opinions and editorial page editor at Florida Today. And in a moment, I'll introduce you to some of my colleagues who have brought questions and issues from across the state. But first, I'd like to thank Senator Rubio for joining us here today. Welcome to Melbourne, Senator.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Now to our interviewers. To my immediate left is Bill Cotterill, a Capitol columnist for the Tallahassee Democrat. Alan Bartlett is editorial page editor of the Naples Daily News. Eve Samples is the opinion and engagement editor at Treasure Coast Newspapers. And Cindy McCurry-Ross is executive editor of the News Press in Fort Myers. I want to start, Senator, by giving you a minute to make an opening statement about why you're the better choice to represent people in our far-flung communities.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I want to thank those who are watching this broadcast. And let me begin by acknowledging what an honor and a pleasure it's been to serve in the United States Senate. Actually, I've had the opportunity to serve for 9 years in the Florida legislature, 2 of them as Speaker, and then now 6 years in the United States Senate. I'm proud of our achievements and of our accomplishments. We passed the Girls Count Act, which takes on human trafficking. When I say we, I mean we passed that law. We passed the VA accountability law. We pass laws that bring accountability and transparency to the way we give out foreign aid across the world. On 2 occasions, we passed sanctions against Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. We passed sanctions against Hezbollah. And I was instrumental in achieving the passage of the Central Everglades Planning Project, which is critical to the restoration of the Everglades and to so many of the issues we face with water in our state. That's a lot of work in 6 years, despite being in the minority for 4 of those 6 years. But there's more work to be done. And not only do I want to continue to do that work, but I believe the U.S. Senate will play a more important role than it has in modern history. Because the one thing I do believe is that no matter who is elected our next president, you're going to need to have a Senate that will act as a check and balance on bad ideas, bad proposals, and potentially even bad behavior. And that's one of the reasons why I changed my mind and sought to re-election. I'm the only one in this race that will do that. I'm the only one in this race that has the record of achievement that I've just outlined. And I look forward to talking about that and also the future in our interview here today.
Okay, well, Senator, before we move on to some of our regional questions, I want to clear the air with a question about your commitment to doing the job in this term. During your first term, you missed a lot of votes. As of July 2016, you'd missed 234 out of 1,616 votes in the Senate. That was an absentee rate of about 14.5%, more than other senators. And so the question for our viewers and voters is, how can they be assured that you'll show up and do the work in a further term?
Well, 2 separate issues on the vote. I did miss a lot of votes. I didn't like it. I missed a lot of votes for the same reason everyone who's ever been a sitting senator that ran for president has missed votes. My voting record's better than Hillary Clinton's was, than Barack Obama's was, than John Kerry's was, than John McCain's was. I was running for president of the United States, not of Apple Computer. I wanted to serve, continue to serve this country at the executive level. And when you do that, you're going to miss votes. Bernie Sanders missed votes this year as an example. My commitment, however, is proven by my results. I've gotten things done. Laws under my name, laws that we wrote, that we worked through the process, became law and were signed by this president. I've outlined a few of them. And not only did we pass laws, we were also instrumental in key issues. I give you one example. The Central Everglades Planning Project, which is critical to the restoration of the Everglades, has been tied up for almost a decade, primarily because of one senator, Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, who was the chairman of the committee that oversees it. It took me a couple years on working on him, but not only did I get him to change his position, he actually cited the algae blooms in the lagoon on the floor of the Senate as one of the reasons why we needed to pass the Everglades bill. That took time, that took work, that shows commitment. I'm also proud of our constituent service. We have helped, just yesterday I had a gentleman come up to me in Broward County and thank me because we helped him bring his family from Venezuela who were in danger, their lives were in danger, and he thanked me for helping him get that visa. I have veterans call us every day and thank us for helping them process through the system of the VA, which they really shouldn't need our help, but they do because the system is broken. So our commitment is proven by the work we've done and the results we've achieved. Yes, I ran for president, I missed votes, I didn't like it, but everyone who has run for president has had to do the same if they want to run a credible campaign.
Okay, let's hand the next question to Bill Cotterill.
Senator, as you're aware, about 11 years ago, we lost rail service in North Florida because of Hurricane Katrina over in New Orleans. Lately, there has been revived interest in restoring Amtrak across the Panhandle, Jacksonville, down to this part of the state. And of course, also there's the All Aboard Florida service, Miami, Orlando, that you're probably much more familiar with. What have you done to help restore the Sunset Limited up there, and what is the outlook in the new Congress, do you think?
Well, two separate issues. In the North Florida corridor, that's not currently an active or planned one, and so the issue with Amtrak in general is the ridership does not justify the cost. So in essence, it will have to be a federal expenditure in order to run Amtrak. That's true all over the country, especially in the Northeast corridor. Even though they have high ridership, the numbers don't justify the ridership. So you have to acknowledge right up front that if we're going to restore rail service for passenger, it's going to cost money, federal money. Ridership will not justify the cost at a time of both deficits and debt. That's very difficult to do. I do believe we have some significant infrastructure issues that we need to confront. The question becomes, is that money better spent in rail, or is it better spent in expanding roads and improving our infrastructure, bridges, and the like? And that's a debate that should be driven by the facts and the numbers, not by the preferences that someone may have from one industry over another. All aboard Florida is a different proposition. The concept sounds great. The problem is that it's disrupting communities along the route that see none of its benefits. And it's using substantial federal assistance in order to move forward for their bonding capacity. And that's a problem for me. Now, it's largely been something that's been driven at the state level. I've had some significant questions, and I've raised them about the funding mechanism behind All Aboard Florida. But the fundamental complaint that I get is not from Orlando or from Miami, but the communities in between who get none of the benefit of the rail system, but bear a significant amount of the cost, both in noise and in disruptions. And it is being paid for. If this was a privately funded entity, that's one thing, but they are not. They do use significant leveraging of federal bonding capacity in order to pay for this project. And I do have deep concerns about it, and I've shared them.
Alan Bartlett.
Senator, in your opening, and then also when you responded to Matt, you referred to the comprehensive Everglades restoration program. As we've been interviewing candidates for county office, congressional office, and state legislative office, they've been extremely unhappy that the federal government has broken its 50-50 pledge to fund those projects. One even suggested it's time to give up on Washington and for Florida to do it alone. If you are sent back to Washington, what can you do to break the logjam on those CERT projects?
Well, that was the first step, because before you get the funding, you have to have the engineering and the planning work done. And so a lot of our colleagues around the country would love to have some of that money for their own projects. And so as long as they could tie up Central Everglades Planning Project, they kept tied up the ability to spend the money on it. I continue to remind people that this is not just about the Everglades, but it is the Everglades National Park. It is a federal obligation, and it has made a commitment to the state of Florida to do so. So step one is to get the Central Everglades Planning Project moving forward. It awaits the president's signature as part of the water bill. I believe he'll sign it. Step two is, once that's done, is go and secure the funding, which I will work to get. It's one of the reasons why I have argued against distracting from that effort. If we go back to Washington and say, we want the money for restoration and we also want additional money for a project to buy land south of the lake, you are not going to get both. And what my colleagues up there are going to say, especially the appropriators, who are the guys and gals that divvy out the money, is, you guys in Florida are divided over which one of these two projects you want. Till you figure out which one you want, we'll continue to spend the money in other parts of the country. Let's deal with the bird in hand. Let's get this done first. And then after we're done and we've seen the funding begin to flow on the overall restoration and the federal commitment, if there's additional work that needs to be done and the federal government can contribute, we'll examine that and potentially even support it if it's the right proposal. But I really want to finish the work on what we already have in place. Otherwise, you're going to end up with neither.
Eve Samples.
Senator Rubio, you've touched on a question that's deeply important to our region on the Treasure Coast. We had toxic algae blooms in our area. You visited and saw that earlier this year. Thank you for witnessing that. You alluded to a land buy south of Lake Okeechobee. That's something your former colleague in Tallahassee, Senator Joe Negron, has proposed to the tune of 60,000 acres. He sees this as a viable option and that it should be pursued simultaneously with SEP. And the cost is about $2.4 billion. We have a stream of state money via Amendment 1 funds to pay for it at the state level. Can you elaborate on why we can't pursue this simultaneously in Tallahassee and
I've
Washington?
talked to Senator Negron about it because we're friends. And I explained to him, it's not that I'm against his idea. If he wants to move forward on the state component of it, he most certainly can, and I'm not against him doing that. The only thing I've said is we need to take into account these communities south of Lake Okeechobee. Many of them are poor communities, unemployment rates as high as 20%. Every time you take agricultural land out of capacity and out of production, you are going to cost jobs. You could potentially see a scenario where some of these communities become ghost towns, and they're already financially depressed. They need to be a part of this conversation too. That said, and so should the small growers and farmers and others in that region. Everybody talks about the big growers, but the small growers are impacted by some of this as well in terms of capacity. In terms of the state component, if they want to begin their process using Amendment 1 money, using state funds, they have every right to do so, and I'm not against them doing that. All I'm saying is I'm not going to begin to work on the federal part of whatever project Senator Negron has until we first feel comfortable we're going to get the SEP project fund. And some of them, by the way, are interrelated. There are components of SEP that could very well be complementary to or even overlap with some of the stuff that Senator Negron is talking about, so there's no conflict on those. I don't want to create confusion. We don't want to go to Washington and say, we need Everglade restoration money, but we also need additional money for purchases, because then my colleagues around the country are going to say, you guys don't know what you want. You want all kinds of things. We're going to go ahead and keep spending the money where we want to spend it, and then when you guys make up your mind, you'll get yours. I think we need to focus on one at a time.
Okay, and just to be clear, this is an issue not just on the east side of the state, but on the
Correct.
west side too,
Absolutely.
with the Caloosahatchee estuary. As another follow-up to that, much of the land identified by Senator Joe Negron, state senator, is owned by the sugar industry. Sugar industry has supported your career as a politician over the years. Since 2000, you and Super PAC supporting your campaigns have received more than $600,000. So talk about your current relationship with leaders of the sugar industry and tell us what role you think they should play in addressing these problems we're talking about.
Well, they own the land, number one. Number two, they buy into my agenda. I don't buy into theirs. I support agriculture. I want Florida to have a sugar industry. It employs people. It creates jobs and opportunity. And you visit those communities and you see that there are people, not just the owners of the land, but their employees and the communities that provide services and goods to them that benefit from the presence of agriculture, including sugar growers. That said, they're owners of the land. If the government wants their land, they can go in through eminent domain and attempt to take it. And they're going to get compensated for that land. They're going to make a lot of money from that sale. So either way, they really don't lose. And so that's why I always viewed that as a false argument. One way or the other, these agricultural interests are going to win. They're going to get paid a lot of money for land through 10 years of eminent domain fighting, or they're going to continue in production. My view is, what is the appropriate way to do it that doesn't hurt the communities in the glades, and number two, that we can actually get done. And that's what I don't want to see at risk. I am not against Senator Negron's proposal. I'm just saying that the federal component of it is not something we can begin to work on until we first are secure in getting the overall Everglades restoration funds. We're not going to get both at the same time out of Washington. You haven't even gotten one at a time yet after 10 or 15 years.
Cindy McCurry-Ross.
So just to be clear, you would be supportive of Senator Negron's proposal to buy land south, but just simply not the federal component or support of that?
Yeah, it's a state issue. I mean, they're going to debate it in the state legislature. They're going to talk about whether they can afford to do it. They're going to talk about the wisdom of it, and I respect their right to do it. And again, I do have concerns. I want to be clear, even in the state portion of it, I want to ensure that those Glades communities are involved in the conversation and that we're not economically distressing that region even worse than it already faces. That said, my role as a federal policymaker is they're saying we're going to need federal money to pay for some of this plan in the future. And my response to them is we're not going to begin that process, and that isn't going to happen until we first finish through the SEP and SERP process, in essence the restoration process, because you're not going to get both at the same time. And if you try to get both at the same time, you're going to wind up with neither.
Great, thank you. Switching gears, we have a question from one of our audience members, Gloria Graff of North Fort Myers, Florida. And she says both presidential candidates seem to agree that some level of immigration reform is in order. Her question is, should Cuban immigrants be treated the same as Mexican, Haitian, Syrian, and other immigrants from around the world? And now that U.S. relations with Cuba are beginning to improve, should there be an end to the wet foot, dry foot policy?
And I've said that that is actually an issue that we need to talk about more. I tell you what I've already supported. All these issues impact thousands of people, so I want to make sure that we're not doing anything that isn't responsible. But one thing I'm already certain we need to do is we need to change the way benefits are given to people that arrive from Cuba. Today, if a Cuban refugee or immigrant arrives from abroad, they are immediately given legal status. But they're also immediately given refugee status, which immediately qualifies them potentially for thousands of dollars of public benefits right off the bat. No other immigrant gets that except Haitians as well because they have similar status. That's being abused. I have people coming into my office that just got here from Cuba. They know the benefits they're entitled to better than my office staff sometimes does. And oftentimes they're living in Cuba 6 months a year. and receiving benefits and having it wired to them by Western Union. And so what I've argued is we need to end that process. If you come from Cuba, you need to prove that you are a refugee. In essence, you will no longer be automatically assumed to be a refugee. I've actually drafted and proposed language to do that. We've had some resistance, primarily because a lot of my colleagues don't believe this is true. They actually can't believe that we're doing this. The Cuban Adjustment Act should be re-examined in light of what we now see. You have a country that we now have diplomatic relations with, that we are allowing people to travel back and forth to. You have people coming under the Cuban Adjustment Act, and within a year and a day they travel back to Cuba 18 times. But the law was written for people that were fleeing political persecution. How could you be going back 18 times a year to a place that you fear persecution in? It's hard to justify. I've been making this argument for 8 or 9 years now, that if this status of our relationship with Cuba changed, the Cuban Adjustment Act was in danger. And I do believe that the Cuban Adjustment Act needs to be revisited, perhaps revised, and potentially even repealed, depending on what the facts show us in the years to come. But as it currently stands today, it is impossible to justify.
This next question comes from Pensacola News Journal editor Lisa Nelson-Lara, who could not be here today.
Northwest Florida coastlines were among those most directly ravaged by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Senator Bill Nelson has opposed recent moves to expand drilling and energy exploration from neighboring Gulf Coast states such as Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. As a senator, will you flatly oppose any expansion of oil-related drilling and energy exploration in the Gulf Coast?
As long as it can be done safely, I think our country needs to fully utilize all of its energy resources. Obviously, the BP oil spill was a terrible disaster, and that's what it was. It was a disaster. But in the end, we have over 5 decades now of offshore exploration that has a safety record that, for the most part, exceeds that of most other industries. So America needs to have the option, at the least, of fully exploring its energy resources. And that's why I've been supportive of it, even in the height of the spill. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't increase standards. Quite frankly, right now, given the price of oil around the world, there isn't going to be a lot of new exploration now or in the years to come. But I believe America should have the opportunity to fully explore its resources if it can be done in a responsible way that is good for the environment, but also good for our country and its economy.
Well, now I'd like to ask a question from my own backyard,
Yes,
right
sir.
here, Brevard County. The U.S. space program in Florida includes Kennedy Space Center, NASA programs to explore Mars. It includes innovative private contractors such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, and United Launch Alliance. And it includes the U.S. Air Force Space Command and its strategic assets. And so what I'd like to hear from you is what directions or plans do you support for the U.S. space program?
And what we've already done, too, because number one of the things we were able to pass quite recently is something that will allow for space mining. I know it sounds kind of sci-fi, but the ability to mine asteroids for resources and revenue. One of the reasons why we want to do that is we think Florida will be a leader in those sorts of launches in the future. So that's important. But you cannot have a program like the space program if it doesn't have a strategic vision for its future. What is it going to be about? And to do that, it has to have a very clear mission and a big mission. And I believe the mission to Mars is the right thing to organize our NASA programs around in terms of human travel. Because with that big goal is what allows everyone to pull in the right direction, as opposed to this debate that was going on for a number of years. We want to go back to the moon. I think the Mars mission is a doable one. We're beginning to make progress in that direction, and I think that's the right mission to organize NASA around deep space exploration. I would like to see an increased and continued opening for the commercial sector in near Earth orbit exploration, and for Florida to be the leader in that industry. And I think, I don't just say that as a Floridian, it actually makes sense. We have the infrastructure, we have the expertise, we have the land, we have the air easements, we have everything we need in Florida. It makes no sense to try to replicate that in 15 other states. And I think that's what the private sector will conclude as well. There's a great partnership between the state of Florida and the space industry and the NASA to continue to position us there. So for me, it's a combination of two things: opening up more space for commercial travel, for near Earth orbit, and then allowing NASA to focus on the deep orbit missions, such as the mission to Mars.
All right, well, let's go back around the state, starting with Bill Cotterill.
Senator, from our part of the state in Tallahassee and a lot of other university communities, a lot of families and students are concerned with the level of student debt. I believe nationwide it's a huge amount that young people are saddled with as they start their careers. And I believe you've spoken to this in your own education and career. What do you think is doable? Anything from making college tuition free, as some of the Democrats have proposed, What do you think is actually doable in addressing this for producing the next generation of educated leaders?
Well, I actually have a complete and comprehensive higher education set of policies, and they're all bipartisan. It begins by acknowledging that higher education in the 21st century is not going to mean what it's always meant in the past. There's always going to be a 4-year liberal arts component, graduate school, traditional schools. They will always be on the menu. But in the 21st century, we need alternatives to that. It begins with more vocational and career training. Some of the best paying jobs of the 21st century require less than 4-year degrees. Some require 1 or 2 years. Some you can even learn in high school. So you can be graduating people from high school at 18 years of age, certified in an industry and ready to work. I actually supported measures to make that easier in Florida as the Speaker of the House as part of 100 Ideas. I've supported initiatives to open up Pell Grant. So a high school student who wants to study vocational training doesn't have to wait till they're 18 before they can begin vocational training at a community college. They can use Pell Grant while still a high school student for dual enrollment. The second is we need to create more competition for higher education, which is why I've supported an alternative accrediting model that allows innovative practitioners to create alternative ways to acquire higher education by packaging learning from a variety of sources. Today, a college degree is basically an accredited curriculum. You sit in a classroom, you take 120 credit hours, you get a bachelor's degree. It really shouldn't matter where you learn it. If you've learned it and you've mastered it, you should get credit for it. And again, through innovative platforms that will allow people to combine learning from a variety of sources: work experience, life experience, military experience, online learning. This is especially critical to a 25-year-old single mother raising 2 children on her own, has to work full time. She can't drop everything and go to school for 2 years. But if she was able to package learning, like what she's learned working as a receptionist at a law office, to become a paralegal, that's going to double or triple her pay. She can't do that in the traditional model. So that's something else that's bipartisan. Mark Warner and I have the right to know, Right to Know Before You Go Act. And what it says basically is that before you take out a student loan, of which I owed over $100,000, by the way, at one point, before you take out a student loan, schools have to tell you, this is how much people make when they graduate from this school with that degree that you're seeking. You can still get the loan, but you can at least make a cost decision about whether it's worth borrowing that much money for the degree that you're seeking. These are important measures that I think will, and I also have another initiative that allows for alternatives to student loans called the Student Investment Plan. I think it will be useful for graduate students. You can go to a private investment group. They can basically analyze you the way they would investing in a small business, and they agree to pay for your tuition in exchange for a percentage of your income over a 10-year period. And if it works out and you go on and be successful, they make their money back with a profit. And if they're not, they made a bad investment. But all the risk is on them, not on the student. Again, it's an alternative to student loan. It's not a requirement. Purdue is actually innovating that right now. So these are a package of reforms that I think will bring about reform, competition, and more choices for students than what they face today.
Naples.
After 10 years of good fortune, we've seen Florida come under siege from major storms again, and it's caused significant beach erosion, both in terms of when there's a major storm, but also as far as general replenishment of the beaches. Where do you feel the responsibility lies to pay for that? The federal government, the local government, the state government, and in what combination?
Well, I believe that if it's just normal day-to-day occurrence of erosion, particularly in places where the beaches are not there, they're actually been built out of dredging for purposes of developing those communities, those are places where that is a function of the state and local government. I know we funded some of that when I was in the state legislature, but again, that is a resource of the local community. When it's the result of a major catastrophic event, such as potentially when I was in Daytona Beach the day, I guess, a couple hours after the Matthew hit, and you saw there was already some significant beach erosion in Daytona Beach, that is where the government has stepped up with disaster relief through supplemental funding. We did it for Sandy, we most recently did it for Louisiana and their flooding, and my sense is we'll have to do some of that for Florida. Here's my only caveat, and I've always warned my colleagues on this. I don't want to see a Matthew supplemental relief bill that suddenly is laden with a bunch of spending for all kinds of unrelated projects. That's what we saw with Sandy. It had a piece of it was Sandy, and the rest of it was for the Great Lakes, for Alaska, for everybody else. That is what I don't want to see, and that happens too often. But I do think the federal government has a role to play, even in beach renourishment, if it's the result of a major cataclysmic or event, such as a storm or a hurricane.
I have a question about the economy now. In our region on the Treasure Coast, Port St. Lucie was arguably ground zero for the Great Recession. It was a bedroom community hit very hard by the housing bust. tried to reinvent itself with some economic development projects that were heavily invested in by the state, and that didn't work out so well in most cases. So my question for you is, what do you see as the greatest opportunity for job and economic growth in Florida, and what specific policy action have you taken to leverage that? Please speak in specifics, not generalities.
Well, first of all, you have to start with generalities, because, and then you can talk into specifics, but the generalities are, how does jobs and opportunity created? And it's created through a pretty straightforward formula. Someone or something, an entity that has access to money, risks the money to start a business or to grow an existing one. We have to make America the best place in the world to do that. Today it is increasingly uncompetitive. We have the highest combined business tax rate in the world. We are one of the few remaining countries on the planet that double tax our companies if they bring foreign profits back to the United States. We have a regulatory burden that's quite significant and extensive. And all that needs to be reformed. We also need a higher education system that prevents the workforce, that produces the workforce necessary for those 21st century industries. And all these things we just talked about with higher education are important for that. In terms of what Florida has a strategic advantage in, people will always talk about our tourism industry. And let me tell you, I was raised through the tourism industry because my parents worked there. That will always be a component and a part of us, and we should never reject it. But I think we have unique opportunities in aerospace technology in the state. We have a built-in infrastructure for it, both physical infrastructure and human capital. And I would want to see Florida continue to be a leader, not just in the space program, but in the aerospace program, in the defense contracting industry, in all sorts of the spin-off innovations that come about as a result of the space program and aerospace industry. And one of the ways to do that is to protect that core, to ensure that government investment is still happening in the basic research that is NASA. Because the spin-off of that is what's creating these jobs and opportunity that are not just isolated to the Space Coast. They could extend, we've seen some of it extend already into Central Florida, not just eastern Central Florida. The other industry that provides this real opportunity is trade. Florida is strategically positioned to be a leader in Western Hemispheric trade in particular as an entry point, and which is why I've always supported free trade deals that are fair. So the Colombian trade deal is a good deal for America. As an example, we need to continue, and it's one of the reasons why I care about hemispheric stability, because I want to see developed economies in the region. They bring products into our ports, which create jobs in the transportation sector, and into logistics, and likewise for export purposes. I also think agriculture in Florida is an industry that can be a key part of our future. But I think the one place where you look at and say Florida has a strategic advantage over the rest of the country is in the investments of over 50 years in space and aerospace industries, because we have both the physical and human infrastructure in place that other states still do not have.
So let me stop you there. One specific example of a policy decision or action you've taken to help leverage that.
Well, as I said, Congressman Posey and I proposed that bill that will make it easier for space exploration in terms of mining. You know, go to an asteroid and mine it for minerals and mineral rights, and allowing the commercial sector to expand into that space. One of the reasons why we did it is we believe Florida will be a leader in that industry, in the launches, in the equipment necessary to develop it, and in all the spin-off that's going to come from it. So it's not something that gets a lot of attention on the news, and it's probably something that's going to happen in 25 or 30 years, maybe 10, but the point is that that is an industry that you look at and say that is a place where Florida can have a unique foothold that New Mexico is not going to have, and Georgia is not going to have, and Virginia is not going to have. So that's one example of it. And the other, quite frankly, is a little bit broader, but it's the role of NASA. There is still a view among some in our government that we can't afford the space program right now. It makes no sense to have it. And the argument we always make is NASA isn't just about doing cool things that you see on television. It also has a military and national defense component to it. It has a commercial spin-off component to it. And then the argument that great nations do great things. The leading exploration nations on Earth have always been the leading nations on Earth throughout the history of mankind.
Thank you.
Let's switch from really big business to small business.
Yes, ma'am.
And we have another question from a reader in Fort Myers who asks, while you have been in Congress, large banks have reduced their funding for small business. What will you do to increase the availability of capital for our small businesses to grow?
And one of the reasons why is Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank has imposed upon banks capital requirements and regulatory requirements that small community banks can't meet. And so what a lot of them have done over the years is they've sold. You've seen a consolidation of the banking industry. These large banking industries, these large banking conglomerates, and they don't like it when I say it, but it's true, their core business is not lending to small business. That has always been the role of the community banker. The community banker, if they come to see you, will tell you that they are having trouble operating today. because they face many of the same regulatory burdens, but they don't have the internal infrastructure to deal with all of this regulation that's coming upon them. Regulators pouring through their books, questioning every loan that they make. In many cases, they are impeded from being able to give loans based on market conditions in a community because they don't meet the strict guidelines of some national standard that was largely designed for big banks but is now being applied to mid-sized and smaller banks. So I'd like to see some of that rolled back so that community banking can restart in this country, because it is at the community banking level where most startup businesses are getting their funding. In the absence of that, then the only source people have for capital is angel investors, unregulated investment space, oftentimes people maxing out credit cards if they can get it or selling assets. But I do believe there are significant number of small businesses that never even started because of a lack of access. The Small Business Administration, which we oversee in the Small Business Committee, can play an important role in some of it, but it cannot replace the role of a vibrant community banking industry in our state that today is largely evaporated over the last 10 years. Many of them have either closed or been bought up by the big banks who are not in the business of doing $15,000 loans to start up a wedding planning business and the like.
Can you be more specific about what level of rollback in the regulations that you would advocate?
I want to see small banks under a certain size exempted completely from some of these requirements that you see under Dodd-Frank, including the capital requirements that they're under. Because here's the bottom line: if they have, just using a round number, they have $1 million in deposits, and you tell them they have to hold 80% or 70 or 60% in back, and that means they can only lend 40% of it, and that 40% is now that 60% is now restricted from being able to lend it. That less capital is available. You're also imposing upon them regulatory costs, and so if they're going to lend money, and they're going to have regulators looking over every loan they make, they might as well loan the money to established businesses who are easier to justify to a regulator than a startup business that has no record of being in business. And I've actually seen firsthand realities of this. I know a gentleman who's worked for 20 years as an employee in a dry cleaning business. He decided he wanted to open his own shop, but that's capital intensive. He had a great idea. He certainly knew the industry, but he couldn't get anybody to loan him the money because he didn't have a business plan and he'd never run a business before. And they all told him, if I loan you money, a regulator is going to show up and say, why did you make this bad loan to someone who's never done this before? And I won't be able to justify it to them. So I do want to see a lot of these capital restrictions and regulatory reviews of the small and mid-sized banks significantly rolled back from the levels they're at today.
Thank you.
Senator, I have another question from the Pensacola News-Journal.
Military bases in Northwest Florida are the cornerstone of our community. They live daily with the fear that the national debt will have an impact on their presence here in our community. Are cuts to bases such as the Pensacola Naval Air Station on the table as you look at how to deal with the ever-growing national debt?
No, and in fact, I want to reverse the sequester on defense. I voted against the sequester. It was a bad deal made by members of my party, as a matter of fact, in 2011, and here's why. It's hurting our ability to protect our country, it's hurting local communities that have a military presence, and it's doing nothing to balance our budget. Because the driver of our long-term debt is not military spending. Does that mean that we don't need more efficiency in the Pentagon? Of course we do. Of course we do, because every dollar you waste in defense spending is a dollar that isn't defending our country. But you're not going to balance our budget by rolling back defense spending. The long-term driver of our debt is the current structure of Medicare and Social Security for my generation, not for current beneficiaries. My mother's on it. I don't want to see any changes for her. I don't want to see any changes for anyone who's going to retire in the next 10 years. But here's a fact. We better have people that are willing to tell the voters the truth. There is no way Social Security and Medicare looks the same way for me as it did for my mom and my dad. It either won't exist or it'll be in crisis by the time I retire in 25 or 30 years. And so the sooner we act, the less disruptive those changes are going to be. And the changes we need are not draconian. Instead of retiring at 67, I may have to retire at 68. If I've made a lot of money, my benefits aren't going to be as much as they are for someone who made less money. These are not unreasonable changes for someone who's 25 or 30 years away from retirement in exchange for helping bring the debt under control, being able to fund the military because we don't have to cut it to pretend we're doing budget balancing, and leaving it undisrupted for the people who are on it now or about to retire who can't afford any changes to their plan.
I'd like to ask a question for people here in Central Florida. You were at the scene of the Pulse nightclub shooting a couple months ago. You know the aftermath of gun violence. The Senate took up several gun control measures a couple of years ago. None of them passed. One of them, I was surprised because it was supported across the board in Florida by gun owners and Republicans as well, and that was the universal background checks. You voted no on that. Explain.
Well, first, it wasn't a universal background check. What it said, the vote that it took was a vote to prevent people on the terror list or no-fly lists from being able to exercise their Second Amendment right. And in theory, we're all in favor of that. The problem is that while those lists are better, they are better than they used to be, there are people on those lists, including a journalist at the Weekly Standard who wound up on that list because he traveled often to the Middle East. And the process of getting your name off that list is complex, expensive. It requires lawyers through a federal process. Could take years in some cases. The only thing I've argued is if we're going to do that, let's also ensure that there's due process for people that don't belong on that list so they can be quickly and cost effectively removed, which is why I wrote my own law. And my law is actually more expansive than some of the laws that were voted on. For example, the law I'm proposing says that if you have even been investigated for terror, not even on the list, just investigated for terror, and you go in to try to buy a gun, the FBI and the Justice Department are immediately notified that you're trying to buy a gun and the sale is suspended. The FBI is then given the opportunity to look into what you're up to. And if they can see that you're involved or potentially involved in a terrorist act, they can arrest you immediately for it. If that had happened in this case, the FBI would have been told Omar Mateen, who was on your list a few years ago but isn't on it now, just went in and bought 2 guns. And they would have been able to immediately pull up and see what he was up to and perhaps prevented him, not just from buying the gun, but from committing the terror act. They could have looked at his Facebook page. They could have interviewed the people around him, but they were never notified of it. The other thing it does, so it does create a due process where an individual who says, hey, I'm on this list because I have the same name as someone that's similar, but it's not me, can be taken off that list without this lengthy, expensive process. I actually think the law I've written could get 60 votes and pass in the Senate. And so we'll see if people are truly looking forward to making the process better. My proposal would make that better. And the last point I would make about Pulse is we don't say it enough. The Pulse attack was not a random act of violence. It was motivated by an allegiance to radical Islamic terror, as evidenced by the conversation that animal, that terrorist, had with a hostage negotiator on behalf of the police department. The transcripts are now publicly available, and you can see that he repeatedly states that the purpose of his attack was to carry out jihad. Homegrown violent extremism is an incredible danger to our country. This guy was born in Queens, New York, raised in Florida, benefited from the greatness of our country, and became a radicalized Islamist and killed 49 innocent people.
Tallahassee.
Senator, if I could revert, you were talking a moment ago about Social Security before the gun question. And one thing you did not mention was raising the taxable wage cap, which I believe is something like 117,000. I forgot where the cutoff point is. Would you consider that to be a tax increase?
Yes.
And would it make...
It's a payroll tax increase.
But if we want to make Social Security solvent for the foreseeable, isn't that something we're going to need to count on?
It doesn't do enough. It barely makes a dent on the long-term trajectory of the program for numerous reasons. Number one, the vast majority of American taxpayers never reach that level. Number two, it just doesn't generate enough. It doesn't fix the problem. The only way to fix the problem is to change the way the program works for future beneficiaries. Social Security was designed when we had 60 people working for every person who was retired. Today, it's down to 3 to 1. It's going to get down to 2 to 1. It won't work. The reforms I'm talking about will work. It will expand it beyond the next 40, 50, 60 years and add life to this program. And the failure to do that is going to require us over the next 15 to 20 years to make some pretty dramatic changes that could impact current beneficiaries if we don't act now. And I remind it because all the scare tactics that come with this are very typical. He wants to change Medicare and Social Security. If you are on it now, if you're going to retire over the next 10 or 12 years, nothing. It's going to be the same thing. Maybe we can even make it better. I'm talking to people like me. I'm talking to people that are 35, 30 years of age, and I'm being honest with them. By the time they're 65, 67, whatever, this program that we have now will be insolvent unless the changes are made. And the longer we take to make those changes, the harder it's going to be to do and the more disruptive the changes are going to have to be. We've already wasted too much time getting on this.
Naples.
From Naples and Collier County, like a couple of other counties in Florida, we have the extremes in terms of wealth. We have, some of the wealthiest people in the country. We have some of the poorest people in the country. I want to keep the focus on taxes here. And last year you rolled out the Lee Rubio plan. You talked about it during the presidential campaign. And some of the reaction to your plan was that it will increase the debt and it will target the top 1% in terms of beneficiaries. Can you walk us through your tax plan and how it will help the 1%, how it will help the poor, and also help those in between?
Well, first of all, it's not geared towards the 1% because the 1% of income earners in America are largely making the majority of their income through investment income. and they have multiple avenues to shield it today, including not investing it at all, or investing it overseas, or moving, as some have done in order to avoid liability. People make a lot of money, have an incredible amount of flexibility. And the people who we're trying to help are the people that get paid every 2 weeks. My tax plan simplifies it to 3 brackets, 15, 25, and 35. It also combines all business activity to a flat rate of 25%. Today, a C corporation may pay 35, but a small business organized under Subchapter S, which is the vast majority of American businesses, pay 39.5 in some cases, more than the C corp when you take in all the deductions. All business income would be taxed on a flat rate of 25%. That is going to benefit small business. That's going to be a substantial decrease for the 2 or 3 person firm in America, the dry cleaning shop. They're all Subchapter S's. That's how the vast majority of American business activity is organized. For working class Americans, in addition to the lower rate of 15%, I also increased the per child tax credit so that parents have more of their own income. And this is refundable, so it applies even to your payroll tax. So parents are left with more money for the cost of raising children because it is more expensive than ever. There are costs associated with raising children in the 21st century that did not exist in the 1980s. Okay? If you don't have access to Wi-Fi and broadband, you can't do homework. You can't. And if someone doubts it, go to your local McDonald's or Starbucks and you're going to find single moms and single dads and even parents sitting there with their kids because they have free Wi-Fi there and they need it for their kids to get online and do schoolwork. So these are just an example. We also we expand the credit for childcare to people that are both working and going to school. In 39 out of 50 states, childcare is more expensive than going to college. That is a 21st century cost that a lot of people didn't face 25 or 30 years ago that the tax code needs to take into account. I was actually attacked by the Wall Street Journal, by some conservative commentators over the per child tax credit. But that's not our money, that's their money. And all I'm arguing is that allow working families to keep more of what they earn, applying it to their payroll tax so that they can use that money to cost what it, here's what doesn't make any sense to me. If you take the same money and invest it in a piece of equipment, you can write it off your taxes as a business. But if you invest it in our people, basically our children, for their education, for their college, for their daily cost of living, somehow the tax code doesn't take that into account. So that was the core of my proposal. When you take it all together, no, because the changes I made on the business side, including the territorial system of taxation, which would allow us to bring back to the U.S. the $2.7 trillion of American corporate cash parked overseas. That's larger than the Russian economy. That's how much the economic growth that would generate additional revenue for government.
I want to make sure I'm clear. Are you equating families to the poor? Because I'm interested in terms of your tax reform. For those who are the poorest in the United States, what does your tax reform plan do for them?
Well, for the poorest in the United States, they don't pay federal income tax. They pay payroll tax. They still pay taxes. They're paying Social Security and FICA. They're not paying income tax. Below a certain bracket, there is no income tax liability, but there's still a payroll tax liability, which is why I made the child care tax credit and the child tax credit refundable and applicable even to the payroll tax, because it would allow those families that don't have an income tax liability to still benefit from it. I also, by the way, want to reform the earned income tax credit into a wage enhancement program that would allow someone in a low-wage job to say, you're only making $15 an hour, but we're going to enhance that with an additional $10 or $12 an hour to reward work, but also to allow them to take the earned income tax credit on their monthly check as opposed to once a year during tax season. Because during tax season, you get the check in February, but nobody lives like that with a yearly bonus. I would rather that be broken up into 12 increments and added into the paycheck because it's more useful for a family on a daily basis.
We talked about the horrific shootings at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Omar Mateen was from our area on the Treasure Coast, from Fort Pierce, and talked about the problem of reigning in Islamic extremism. There's a companion problem there, however, and the mosque that Mateen occasionally worshipped at was attacked in an arson fire earlier this year. There was also an attack on a worshiper in the parking lot. So my question for you is, as a senator, how can you ensure that our Muslim neighbors, community members, are safeguarded from potential hate crimes and also given fair treatment in potential immigration proceedings?
Well, first of all, by the way I've already done, which is pointing to the service they've provided to our country. I think it was at the last presidential debate on CNN that I pointed to the fact that anyone who had any doubt should travel to Arlington National Cemetery. And among the crosses and stars of David, you'll see crescent moons of brave Americans who died in the service of our country, who are Muslim Americans. by reminding people of the vast majority, the enormous and overwhelming majority of Americans in this country who happen to be of the Muslim faith are patriotic Americans who love this country. Many of them came here fleeing the sort of intolerance in other countries that they have been able to escape by coming here. By reminding people that that mosque is the one that turned Mateen in. They are the ones that tipped off BFBI that this guy was a potential radical. And we need to see more of that in America. And you're not going to get it if people are scared to come forward for fear of persecution. So it's important for those of us in public office to say what I've said during a Republican primary, what I've said in this campaign, and what I've said in the service of my service in the Senate. That doesn't mean that we can't condemn the radicalization of that or any religion that calls for people to be murdered and killed in the name of that faith. We can't ignore that the origins of radical Islam is an interpretation of Islam. In the case of ISIS, a radical interpretation of Sunni Islam. In the case of Iran, a radical interpretation of Shia. But it is a radical interpretation of a faith that calls and justifies these actions. But the vast majority of Americans who are Muslims do not feel this way. And they live among us, and they serve among us, and they work in my office, and they work potentially in your building, and in your firms, and they love this United States, and they've died in the service of our country. And so we need to remind people of that every day.
As we head to the home stretch of towards Election Day, can you articulate your level of support for your party's nominee, Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, I just be frank. I mean, this is the most unusual election cycle that I've seen since I started voting in 1989. I have never seen a situation that puts people in the position that it's in. I would remind all of you, as you've already reminded me because you asked about the votes, that this is not the choice I wanted us to have. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I mean, this is not the choice I wanted us to have. Donald was not my first choice. He was not my 10th choice. He's the choice of 14 million Republican voters. So everyone's going to have to make their own decision. I'll tell you about mine. I see two candidates who I disagree with deeply. One, I disagree with his behavior and I've condemned it. I disagree with many of Donald's public policies and I've taken contrary positions to them publicly as recently as this week. When it comes to Secretary Clinton, I literally disagree with her on virtually every major issue before America. And so for me, it came down to a choice between someone I disagree with on virtually everything and someone I disagree with on many things. And it's, as I said, a less than ideal choice. There's no doubt about it. And when you have two less than ideal choices, you're going to have a less than ideal decision as a result. But it's also the reason why I changed one of the main reasons why I changed my mind and ran for the Senate, because I know that no matter who is elected, you're going to need to have a Senate that's willing to stand up to the president, as it should in our constitutional system, when the president is wrong on policy. And I'm the only one in this race that's been willing to do that. I have criticized the nominee of my own party when he's wrong on policy. On the other hand, my opponent, Patrick Murphy, has never deviated, not even once, to step forward and express concern about anything Hillary Clinton stands for and does. So I'm not going to be a rubber stamp for a president of my own party, but he would. And that's a big difference in this race.
Thank you.
Senator Rubio, I'm told you have just about 2 minutes left before we need to conclude this interview. Quickly, will you run for president again?
In 2020? No. And in fact, as I said, maybe never, to be honest with you. Because as I've said to you and I've said to others, if I wanted to run for president of the United States, I would not have run for re-election to the Senate. A lot of people on November 9th, if Donald doesn't win, are going to immediately run for president. So think about it this way. Running for Senate in the most uncertain political environment in modern history, in the most competitive swing state in the country, and announcing it 3 days before the filing deadline is not necessarily the ideal way to seek office. And yet that is what I've gotten involved in because I want to serve in the Senate, because I want to be there for the next 6 years, because there's things I want to achieve that probably will take longer than 6 years in many cases. I don't think we're going to be done with Everglades restoration in 6 years. And that's what my focus is on entirely. That alone is evidence of what my intentions are with regards to the future. I can't, people keep pointing to this God willing thing that I said at the debate. I always say that because I honestly believe that none of us control our own destiny. But that doesn't mean because I might run for president. It's because other things happen in life that one can't anticipate. But that said, that has nothing to do with running for any other office. It is my full and absolute intention to serve in the Senate for the next 6 years and to do everything I can, and maybe even potentially longer if there's work that needs to be done.
Well, Senator, on behalf of the USA Today Network, including my colleagues in Tallahassee, Naples, the Treasure Coast, Fort Myers, Pensacola, and here in Brevard County, I want to thank you for joining us here in the studio, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this special interview. Don't forget to vote.